Hey guys, tonight we drift back, way back, to a time when the world was younger, the rivers ran a bit wilder, and the most exciting new technology involved figuring out how not to starve. We're heading to ancient Sumer, the land between the rivers, to uncover a story as old as civilization itself, the invention, or perhaps the happy accident of beer. Imagine, if you will, the sun beating down on endless fields of golden grain, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and possibility. You're there, probably with a terrible backache from inventing agriculture. And frankly, your chances of surviving to see next Tuesday without inventing antibiotics first are, let's be honest, slim to none. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really helps the channel find other sleepy history enthusiasts. And as always, I'd love to see where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop it in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see our little global community of night owls and history buffs. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes for a moment if you're not already drifting and picture a vast, flat expanse of land. It's hot. Not just a gentle warmth, but a persistent baking heat that shimmers above the cracked earth in the distance. This is Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, specifically the southern part, Sumer. You're standing somewhere around 7,000, maybe even 10,000 years ago. The air you breathe is dry, dusty, carrying the scent of sun-baked mud and something else. Something green and alive, especially near the two great lifelines of this region, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These rivers are everything. They snake their way down from the distant mountains, carrying silty, nutrient-rich water that, when it floods, lays down a blanket of fertile soil. Without these annual floods, this whole grand experiment of civilization we're about to witness simply wouldn't get off the ground. Or rather, it wouldn't get into the ground, which is where our story truly begins. For millennia, your ancestors and you in this imagined past have been wanderers, hunter-gatherers. Life was a constant search for the next meal, chasing herds, foraging for edible plants, nuts, and berries. It was a tough existence, but it had a certain rhythm and directness. You followed the food. You knew the seasons by the ripening of fruits or the migration of animals. But something is changing, a slow, almost imperceptible shift at first, like the turning of a great cosmic gear. Perhaps it started with observing how seeds, dropped accidentally, sprouted into new plants. Or maybe a particularly bountiful patch of wild grasses kept people lingering in one spot longer than usual. Whatever the spark, the idea of deliberately planting seeds and tending them, of cultivating food instead of just finding it, began to take root, quite literally. This, of course, is the Neolithic Revolution, the dawn of agriculture, and it's a game changer. A mainstream historical fact, so fundamental it's almost easy to overlook, is that the domestication of plants and animals in the Fertile Crescent, which includes Mesopotamia, fundamentally altered human society, paving the way for settled communities, population growth, and eventually cities and states. You're part of this revolution. Your days are no longer spent roaming vast territories. Instead, you're tied to a particular piece of land near the river. Your new concerns involve digging irrigation channels with primitive tools, think sharpened sticks and stone hoes, to bring that precious river water to your fledgling crops. Your back aches in a new way, a farmer, S8, from bending over tender green shoots under that relentless Mesopotamian sun. You're probably wondering if this whole settling down business was such a bright idea. Your diet, once varied with whatever nature provided, is becoming more focused, more reliant on a few staple crops. And the stars of this agricultural show, primarily two types of grain, barley and emmer wheat. Barley in particular becomes a favorite. It's a hardy, adaptable plant, relatively tolerant of the salty soil that could sometimes be a problem in irrigated lands. You learn its seasons, its needs. You watch it grow from a tiny seed to a tall stalk, its head heavy with precious kernels. Harvesting is backbreaking work. You're using flint-bladed sickles or maybe just pulling up the stalks by hand. Thrashing, separating the grain from the chaff, involves beating the stalks on a hard-packed earth floor, then tossing it all into the air so the wind can carry away the lighter chaff, leaving the heavier grains to fall back to the ground. It's dusty, sweaty, repetitive work. You'd probably give anything for a combine harvester and a dust mask, but those are a few millennia down the road. Maybe invent a slightly less itchy loincloth first. Once harvested, the grain needs to be stored. This is a critical step. You can't eat it all at once. It needs to last you through the seasons until the next harvest. Early storage methods are rudimentary. Perhaps clay-lined pits dug into the earth, or woven baskets, or simple clay pots. And here's where things get interesting and potentially a bit bubbly. Imagine you've stored a batch of barley. Maybe it's been roughly ground into a coarse flour or grits using a saddle quern, 2 stones rubbed together. Another task that would make your arms burn. Perhaps you've made some into a simple, unleavened flatbread cooked on hot stones. Or maybe you've just got a pot of barley porridge, a staple food, sitting around. Life is busy. Distractions are plentiful. A gazelle sighting, a squabble with a neighbor over water rights. Some things never change. Or perhaps a particularly captivating sunset over the reed beds by the river. One day, a portion of this grain, or bread, or porridge gets wet. Maybe a leaky roof during a rare rain shower. Maybe a pot was left too close to the riverbank and got splashed. Or perhaps some grain was accidentally dropped into a puddle and forgotten. In the warm, humid climate of Mesopotamia, especially with the ambient wild yeasts floating invisibly in the air. You don't know about yeast, of course. To you, it's just air, something magical, or at least highly unusual, begins to happen to that damp grain. Within a day or two, you notice a change. The wet mass of barley might start to bubble gently. A slightly tangy, fruity smell might emanate from it, different from the usual earthy scent of dry grain or the simple aroma of baked bread. If it was porridge, its consistency might change, becoming thinner, frothier. If it was a piece of bread that got soaked, it might look swollen and a bit alive. Your first reaction, probably suspicion. Food that behaves unexpectedly is usually food that's gone bad, food that could make you sick. You might poke it with a stick, sniff it cautiously. You and your small community have a deep, ingrained knowledge of what's safe to eat and what's not, learned through generations of trial and error, and probably a few unfortunate ancestral poisonings. This new, bubbly, slightly fragrant concoction is definitely off script. But curiosity is a powerful human trait, and perhaps, just perhaps, hunger is an even more powerful one. Or maybe it's sheer accident. Someone, driven by hunger or daring, or maybe just clumsiness, tastes a little bit of this strange, transformed grain mush. And the sensation is unexpected. It's not the usual blandness of porridge or the dry chewiness of flatbread. There's a new flavor profile, a little bit sour, a little bit sweet, with a curious tingle on the tongue from the dissolved carbon dioxide. And if it's fermented for long enough, there's another, even more surprising effect. A gentle warmth spreading through the body, a lightness in the head, a subtle shift in perception. Worries might seem a little less pressing. The backache from a day in the fields might feel a little duller. Laughter might come a bit more easily. This right here is the birth of beer. Not the refined, filtered, hop-infused beverage we know today, but its earliest, most primitive ancestor. A soupy, slightly alcoholic, fermented grain beverage. It wasn't brewed, it just happened. A gift from the gods, perhaps, or a trick of some mischievous spirit residing in the grain. Historians and archaeologists still argue, with considerable passion, and sometimes even raised voices at academic conferences. Imagine the drama, about the exact sequence of events. This is our open scholarly debate for this section. Historians still argue whether bread came before beer, or beer before bread. Some propose that the discovery of fermentation and its pleasant effects might have been a primary driver for domesticating grains in the first place. The beer before bread hypothesis. The idea is that early humans, enjoying the psychoactive properties of accidentally fermented wild grains, decided it was worth the effort to cultivate these grains specifically to make more of this wondrous beverage. Others argue that bread, as a more obvious and storable food source, likely came first, and beer was a happy byproduct, discovered when bread or porridge accidentally fermented. It's a fascinating chicken or egg scenario, lost in the mists of prehistory, and the evidence is tantalizingly ambiguous. You could probably get a decent PhD just trying to sort that one out. Whichever came first, the discovery was monumental. Let's imagine that initial tasting. You or your brave, hungry, foolhardy compatriot have just experienced something entirely new. The immediate effects are mild but noticeable. The world seems a little softer around Thejas. Your companions observing you might see a slight flush on your cheeks, a more relaxed posture, maybe even a slightly goofy grin. They're curious naturally. What's up with Uruk? He looks less grumpy than usual. Then comes the sharing. Hesitantly at first, then with more confidence as no one immediately keels over. And as a small group partakes, a new social dynamic might emerge. A shared experience, a loosening of inhibitions, a communal feeling of well-being. This wasn't just about a new foodstuff, it was about a new experience. Of course, there would have been mishaps. Too much fermentation or the wrong kind of microbial critter getting involved could lead to something truly foul-tasting, or worse, something that causes sickness. Early quality control was probably based on smell, a cautious sip, and observing whether the village elder who tried it first started dancing or just looked a bit green. There were no hydrometers, no thermometers, no handy guides to wild yeast strains. It was all instinct, observation, and a healthy dose of luck. A quirky tidbit here is that early humans were likely consuming a beverage that was far more of a living food than our modern pasteurized beers, full of active yeast and bacteria, some beneficial, some less so. It would have been a probiotic punch, for better or worse. The first beers were likely thick, like a thin gruel unfiltered, with bits of grain and chaff floating in them. They wouldn't have been very alcoholic by modern standards, perhaps only 1.3% ABV, similar to what's known as small beer in later historical periods. But for people with no prior experience of alcohol, even this would have been potent enough to be noticeable and significant. You'd probably need a straw, or at least a good straining technique with your teeth, to drink it without getting a mouthful of solids. We'll see later how the Sumerians ingeniously solved this problem. The realization that this wasn't just a one-off fluke, that it could be recreated, would have been another huge leap. Hey, remember that pot of barley that got wet and went all fizzy and made us feel funny? Let's try and do that again. Early attempts at brewing would have been about trying to replicate the conditions of that first happy accident. Perhaps they started intentionally soaking grain, or leaving porridge out in a warm place, covered loosely to keep out the worst of the bugs and dust, but allowing those mysterious airborne somethings to work their magic. They wouldn't have understood the science of fermentation, the role of yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, if you're taking notes for your prehistoric biochemistry exam. To them, it would have seemed like a spontaneous animation of the grain, a transformation imbued with mysterious power. It's easy to see how this beverage quickly became associated with spirituality, with divine forces. If something so mundane as barley mush could transform itself into something that alters your state of mind and makes you feel good, surely there must be a powerful spirit or deity involved. The land itself, this fertile crescent, was already seen as a place of abundance, a gift from the gods who controlled the rivers and the rains. Now, the very grains that grew from this sacred earth held another secret, another divine blessing. This wasn't just food anymore. It was something more. It was becoming part of the cultural and spiritual fabric of these nascent communities. Think about the implications. This wasn't just a new drink. It was a source of calories, often safer to drink than potentially contaminated water sources. The slight alcohol content would have had some antimicrobial effect, though they wouldn't have known why. It was a social lubricant. It was, quite possibly, a ritual beverage used in early ceremonies to commune with whatever powers they believed governed their world. The journey from a wild patch of barley to a cultivated field, from a dry kernel to a bubbling, life-altering brew, is a profound one. You, standing there in ancient Sumer, are at the very beginning of this journey. You're witnessing the birth of an industry, a tradition, a cultural cornerstone that will span millennia and cross continents. You're probably still a bit confused about why soggy bread makes you want to tell better jokes, but you're definitely intrigued. The sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The day's work is done. The air cools slightly, bringing a small measure of relief. Around a crackling fire, someone brings out a rough clay pot containing this new, curious liquid. It's shared. Voices soften, stories are told. Perhaps a simple song is sung. For a little while, the harshness of life recedes. This is more than just hydration or nutrition. This is community. This is culture. This is the magic of fermentation, discovered by accident, embraced with wonder. The Mesopotamian dawn isn't just about the sun rising over the plains. It's about the dawn of new ideas, new ways of living, and new ways of experiencing the world. And this strange, soupy, slightly intoxicating gift from the grain is right at the heart of it. You might not have plumbing or Wi-Fi, or even a decent pair of shoes, but you've got the beginnings of beer. And for tonight, as you settle back and let these ancient scenes drift through your mind, that's a pretty good start. The landscape around you is slowly, painstakingly being transformed. What were once just reed-filled swamps and arid plains are gradually giving way to a patchwork of small fields and irrigation ditches. The wild grasses that your ancestors gathered are now being deliberately planted, selected for their yield, for the size of their grains. Emmer wheat, and most importantly for our story, barley, are becoming the foundation of this new, settled way of life. Think of the sheer effort involved. There are no beasts of burden-pulling plows yet, not in these earliest stages. That comes later. For now, it's human muscle power. You and your kin are out there, breaking the soil with fire-hardened digging sticks or crude stone hoes. You're clearing reeds, diverting water from small channels that branch off the main rivers. You learn to read the land to understand the rhythm of the floods, the subtle signs of soil fertility. It's a constant battle against weeds, against pests, against the ever-present threat of drought, or, conversely, a flood that wipes out your hard work. You're not just a farmer. You're an engineer, a hydrologist, an agronomist, all rolled into one, albeit a very primitive version. You probably also double as the village scarecrow when it's your turn. The grains themselves are a marvel. Barley, Hordeum vulgare, becomes the preferred grain for many reasons. It's more tolerant of saline conditions than wheat, a problem that can arise from continuous irrigation in an arid climate where evaporation leaves salts behind. It has a shorter growing season. Its husks are tough, offering some protection to the kernel, but they also cling tightly, which will have implications for how it's processed for both food and drink. When harvest time comes, the entire community is mobilized. Every able-bodied person is out in the fields under that blazing sun. The ripe barley stalks, golden brown, are cut with small sickles made by embedding sharp flint chips into a wooden or bone handle. It's slow, meticulous work. You gather the cut stalks into sheaves, then transport them to a communal thrashing floor, a hard, flat area, often paved with packed clay. Here, the grain is beaten with flails or trodden by animals, once they're domesticated and part of the agricultural system, to separate the kernels from the stalks and husks. Then comes winnowing. You toss the threshed mixture into the air with wooden shovels or baskets. The wind, your indispensable partner in this process, carries away the lighter chaff and straw, while the heavier grains fall back onto the floor. You can imagine the air filled with fine dust, chaff sticking to your sweaty skin, the rhythmic thud of flails, the shouts of your fellow villagers. It's a scene of intense activity, vital for survival. If this harvest fails, or if the processing is inefficient, starvation is a very real threat. There's no global market to import grain from if your local crop doesn't pan out. Your Uber Eats order for a pizza is about 7,000 years too early. Once cleaned, the barley needs to be stored. This is where the stage is truly set for our happy accident. Early granaries might be simple pits dug in the ground, perhaps lined with clay or plaster to keep out moisture and pests, though not always successfully. Or they might be large pottery vessels or structures made of mud brick. Despite best efforts, moisture is a constant enemy. A sudden downpour, a leaky storage roof, groundwater seeping into a pit. Any of these could introduce dampness into the stored grain. Now, let's zoom in on that crucial moment of discovery again, fleshing out the scenarios. Scenario 1, the forgotten porridge. Someone in your household prepares a barley porridge, coarsely ground grains boiled with water. It's a staple, filling, if not particularly exciting. A portion is left uneaten, perhaps in a warm corner of your reed-in mud hut. Maybe it's covered with a cloth, maybe not. The wild yeasts, ever present in the environment on fruit skins and the dust carried by insects, find their way in. These microscopic fungi are hungry for sugars. Barley, like all grains, is rich in starches. Enzymes naturally present in the grain, or activated by a little bit of sprouting malting, which we'll get to, start breaking down these starches into simpler sugars. The yeasts get to work on these sugars, converting them into alcohol and carbon dioxide. The porridge starts to bubble. It develops that tangy, slightly alcoholic aroma. Someone, perhaps a child dared by sibling, or an adult curious about the strange transformation, takes a sip. Scenario 2, the soaked bread. You're making simple barley bread. Not the fluffy, leavened loaves we know, but dense, flat cakes, perhaps baked on hot stones or in the embers of a fire. Some of this bread gets wet. Maybe it's dropped in water or rain gets to it. The bread, already containing cooked starches, becomes a perfect medium for yeast activity. It swells, softens, and begins to ferment. The resulting liquid that seeps out, or the saturated bread itself, carries that telltale sign of alcoholic fermentation. Again, curiosity or necessity leads to a taste. Scenario 3, the sprouted grain surprise. Some stored barley gets damp and begins to sprout. This is, in essence, unintentional malting. During sprouting, the grain produces enzymes that convert its starches into sugars, making it slightly sweet. If this damp, sprouting grain is then left in a warm place, or if more water is added, the wild yeasts will again seize the opportunity. This would produce a beverage that's perhaps a bit sweeter and more readily fermentable than just soaked raw grain. This process of malting would later become a deliberate and crucial step in brewing. Whichever way it first happened, the key elements are barley, water, warmth, and wild yeast. The result, a low-alcohol, nutrient-rich, slightly fizzy liquid. The term beer is anachronistic here. The Sumerians would eventually call it cash, but for now it's just that interesting fizzy grain stuff. The initial human reaction, beyond the simple physiological effects, would have been one of awe and perhaps a little fear. In a world where so much was governed by unseen forces, where spirits were believed to inhabit trees, rocks, and rivers, this spontaneous transformation of a familiar foodstuff into something that altered consciousness would surely have been seen as supernatural. It wasn't chemistry, it was magic. It wasn't yeast, it was a divine blessing or the work of a powerful spirit residing within the grain itself. This ties into their worldview. The forces of nature, the sun, the moon, the storms, the life-giving rivers were personified as gods and goddesses. The fertility of the earth, the cycle of growth and harvest were sacred. So it's not a huge leap to imagine that this new, wondrous beverage, derived from the sacred grain, would also be seen as having a divine origin. It might have been offered back to the gods in gratitude, or used in rituals to seek their favor. Let's consider the nutritional aspect. This early beer wasn't just an intoxicant. It was also a source of calories, B vitamins thanks to the yeast, and amino acids. In a diet that might have been monotonous or lacking in certain micronutrients, this liquid bread could have been a valuable supplement. Some scholars even suggest that the B vitamins in early beer helped to compensate for deficiencies in a heavily grain-based diet. contributing to the overall health and viability of these early agricultural populations. So, while you might be chuckling at the thought of your prehistoric self getting tipsy on fermented porridge, you are also, inadvertently, taking your vitamins. No Flintstones chewables for you, just slightly sour, chunky beer. The social impact, even in these very early stages, cannot be understated. Sharing food and drink has always been a fundamental part of human social bonding. Sharing this particular drink, with its unique effects, would have added a new dimension to social gatherings. It could have facilitated storytelling, music making, and dancing, activities that strengthen community ties. It might have eased social tensions, or perhaps, on occasion, exacerbated them if consumed in excess, another timeless human experience, unfortunately. Imagine the first hangover in human history. Ugh, grog, my head feels like a mammoth sat on it. What was in that fizzy barley water? The desire to replicate the experience would have led to experimentation. What if we add more water? What if we use warmer water? What if we let it sit longer? What if we use grain that started to sprout? These early experiments, driven by trial and error, were the first baby steps towards a controlled brewing process. They wouldn't have had a clue about specific yeast strains or optimal fermentation temperatures, but they would have learned through observation what tended to work and what resulted in a pot of undrinkable glop. The containers themselves would have played a role. Porous earthenware pots, common at the time, could have harbored yeast cultures in their very fabric, inoculating new batches. This is a phenomenon seen in traditional brewing and bread-making cultures around the world, where a specific vessel or tool becomes lucky because it carries the right microorganisms. Your favorite brewing pot might just have been a good home for a particularly robust and pleasant-tasting strain of wild yeast. The landscape of Sumer, with its hot days and relatively cool nights, its reliance on river water, its abundance of grain, provided the perfect incubator for this discovery. The people, newly settled, grappling with the challenges and opportunities of agriculture, were receptive to new ways of utilizing their precious harvests. This wasn't just a random event that could have happened anywhere, anytime, though fermentation itself is, of course, a natural process. It was a discovery deeply intertwined with the specific time, place, and culture of early Mesopotamia. You are there, at the very edge of written history. The stories of gods and heroes, the epic poems, the cuneiform tablets detailing laws and transactions, these are still in the future. But the foundations are being laid, not just in mud bricks and irrigation canals, but in shared experiences, in cultural practices, in the very way people are starting to interact with their environment and with each other. And this humble, accidentally discovered brew is part of that foundation. It's a slow, unfolding story, this transition from the wild to the cultivated, from the found to the made. And as you lie there, letting your mind drift back through these ancient millennia, feel the warmth of that Mesopotamian sun, smell the earthy aroma of the fertile soil, and perhaps, just perhaps, catch a faint, intriguing whiff of something new, something exciting, something fermented. The night is young, or perhaps very old, depending on your perspective. And the story of Sumerian beer is just beginning to bubble to the surface. The realization that this wasn't a one-time fluke, that this magical transformation of grain and water could be coaxed into happening again, must have been a moment of profound insight. It moved from the realm of pure accident to something approaching. Well, not science, not yet, but deliberate craft. Picture yourself and your fellow villagers, huddled around a pot, discussing what happened last time. Remember when Og left the barley gruel out by the warm stones near the fire pit for 2 suns? And then it got all frothy and made everyone tell really bad jokes that they thought were hilarious. Yes, and the time before, when Zog's grain basket got soaked in that unexpected rain, and a few days later, the mush at the bottom smelled like fruit and made him dance with the goats. You're essentially engaging in the earliest form of process replication. You try to recreate the conditions. Okay, Og, you get the gruel. Zog, find a warm spot. Everyone else, keep an eye on it, and try not to let the ibexes drink it all before we do. This iterative process of trial and error, repeated over generations, would slowly refine the understanding, however intuitive, of what worked. They'd learned that warmth was generally good, but too much heat might spoil it. They'd learned that some water sources seemed to produce better results than others, perhaps those richer in certain minerals, or carrying more robust wild yeast populations from nearby fruit-bearing plants. The ingredients themselves were simple: grain and water. The primary grain, as we've established, was barley. Its inherent characteristics made it suitable, but it wasn't just any barley. Perhaps they noticed that grain that had accidentally sprouted, gotten damp and started to germinate, produced a sweeter, more readily fermentable liquid. This is the unconscious discovery of malting, a cornerstone of brewing. When grain germinates, it produces enzymes, amylases, that break down the complex starches within the kernel into simpler sugars, like maltose. These sugars are the yeast's favorite food. So, while you wouldn't know an amylase enzyme if it bit you on your prehistoric ankle, you might observe that grain that thinks it's becoming a new plant makes the fizzy drink faster and taste better. This intuitive understanding could have led to practices like intentionally moistening grain and allowing it to sprout slightly before crushing it and mixing it with water. This wouldn't have been a standardized, controlled malting process as we know it, with precise temperature and moisture controls, but rather a rough and ready approximation based on observation. Think of it as malting-like or accidental on-purpose malting. The water source was also critical, though its importance might have been attributed to the wrong reasons. If a particular well or a certain spot in the river consistently yielded a good ferment, it might be deemed sacred or blessed, rather than understood in terms of its mineral content or microbial load, influencing yeast health and flavor profile. Don't use water from the stagnant pool behind Grog's hut. The fizzy drink from that always tastes like old sandals and makes you see angry squirrels. Sound advice, even if the microbiology was a bit fuzzy. And then there's the invisible ingredient, yeast. Billions of wild yeast cells from dozens of different species floated in the air, clung to the skins of fruits, and resided on the surfaces of plants and even the grain itself. Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the brewer's yeast we know and love, was out there, but so were many other yeasts and bacteria like Brettanomyces, which can give funky barnyard flavors, lactic acid bacteria, which can make things sour, like in a Berliner Weiss or Goza, and acetic acid bacteria, which can turn your precious brew into vinegar if you're not careful. Early fermentations would have been a wild free-for-all, a microbial mosh pit. The resulting beverage would have had a complex, variable flavor profile, sometimes pleasant, sometimes less so. It would have been a mixed fermentation, and the dominant strains would depend on the local environment, the season, the specific conditions of that batch. One batch might be pleasantly tart and fruity, another more earthy and bready, and a third might be, well, an acquired taste that no one quite acquired. You can imagine the disappointment when an eagerly awaited batch turned out to be demonstrably unyummy, as one might politely put it. There would be no concept of isolating or cultivating specific yeast strains for another few millennia. However, as mentioned, brewing vessels themselves, typically porous earthenware pots, could have become de facto yeast reservoirs. If a particular pot consistently produced good beer, it would be prized. The yeasts would colonize the microscopic pores in the clay, and when a new batch of work, the sugary liquid extracted from the malted grain, was added, these resident yeasts would spring back to life and get to work, outcompeting some of the other, less desirable wild microbes. This is a form of house culture, even if unintentional. So, Grandma Ernanch's special beer pot that always makes the good stuff wasn't just sentimentality. It was ancient microbiology in action. The first sips we talked about earlier, that initial taste of something new and mind-altering, would have been profound. But it wasn't just about the alcohol. This early soupy beer was also food. It was unfiltered, containing grain solids, yeast cells rich in B vitamins, as we noted, and various fermentation byproducts. It would have been more like a thin, alcoholic porridge or gruel than the clear, sparkling beers of today. This made it a substantial source of calories and nutrients. In a world where securing enough food was a constant concern, a calorie-dense, nutrient-boosted beverage that also happened to be safer than some water sources and made you feel good. That's a quadruple win. You're not just having a drink, you're having a liquid meal with benefits. Your ancient Fitbit would be very confused by the calorie burn versus intake. The strength would have been relatively low. Wild yeasts typically have a lower alcohol tolerance than cultivated brewer's yeast. They might ferment the available sugars until the alcohol level reached, say, 2–4%, and then conk out. This meant that people could drink a fair amount of it without becoming completely incapacitated, allowing it to be part of daily life rather than just an occasional blowout. Though undoubtedly, some ancient Sumerian figured out how to have an occasional blowout. Enki's challenge: see who can finish the ceremonial pot first. Winner gets a headache tomorrow. The very act of making it, even in this primitive form, would have been a communal activity. Gathering the grain, grinding it, a laborious task, often done by women using saddle querns or mortars and pestles. Tending the fermentation, these activities would have involved cooperation and shared knowledge. The recipes, such as they were, would have been passed down orally, from mother to daughter, from elder to apprentice, evolving slowly over time as new observations were made. Remember to add 3 smooth river stones to the pot while it bubbles. My grandmother said it keeps the bad spirits out. Spoiler, it probably didn't, but tradition is tradition. This period, the late Neolithic and early Chalcolithic, Copper Age, sees the gradual development of more permanent settlements. Villages are growing. Mud brick houses are becoming more substantial. Communal storage facilities for grain are being built. And alongside these developments, the practice of making and consuming this fermented grain beverage is becoming established, woven into the fabric of daily existence. It's no longer just a surprising accident. It's becoming a tradition, a part of what it means to be a member of this community. The landscape of Lower Mesopotamia, with its fertile silt deposited by the Tigris and Euphrates, was uniquely suited to grain cultivation on a scale that could support these growing populations, and by extension, support the brewing of surplus grain. This isn't to say that fermentation wasn't discovered elsewhere. Fruit wines and honey meads likely have similarly ancient, independent origins in various parts of the world. But the grain-based fermentation that would lead to beer, as we know it, found its perfect cradle here, in the sun-drenched plains between the rivers. You are a witness to and a participant in one of humanity's oldest culinary adventures. There are no written records from this exact period to tell us precisely what they thought or how they felt, but we can infer from later texts, from archaeological finds, and from our understanding of human nature that this discovery was transformative. It added a new color to the palette of human experience. It provided sustenance, solace, and social cohesion. And it all started with some forgotten grain, a little bit of water, and the invisible magic of yeast, working its wonders in a humble clay pot under the ancient Mesopotamian sky. The first sips were just the beginning of a very long and fascinating story. As your small village slowly grows into a more bustling town, and generations pass, the accidental art of making fizzy grain water begins to transform into a more deliberate, if still somewhat mysterious, craft. The secrets of the ancient brew house, if we can even call those early production sites brew houses yet, are starting to solidify, passed down through observation and oral tradition. You're no longer just hoping for a happy accident. You're trying to guide the process to achieve a more consistent, more palatable result. Though let's be honest, consistency is probably still a distant dream. One batch is divine, the next tastes like old socks steeped in disappointment. Quality control is likely based on who pulls the shortest straw to taste it first. The key to understanding Sumerian brewing, or at least what we can piece together from later cuneiform texts like the hymn to Ninkasi, which we'll explore more deeply later, is that it was intrinsically linked with bread making. Specifically, a type of bread called bapir. This wasn't your fluffy sandwich loaf, nor even the simple flatbreads cooked on stones. Bapir was a twice-baked, incredibly hard barley bread, likely with a long shelf life. Think of it as ancient biscotti, but probably less dunkable in your morning latte, which is still several millennia and a continent away. The preparation of bapir was a crucial first step in the brewing process. You take your barley, perhaps coarsely ground. Some sources suggest the barley used for bapir might have been malted, that is, allowed to sprout and then dried to develop those crucial enzymes and sugars. Others suggest it was unmalted barley, or a mix. The ground barley would be mixed with water and perhaps some spices or flavorings. Honey, dates, or aromatic herbs might have been added, though direct evidence for this in the earliest periods is scarce. This dough would then be shaped, not into loaves, but perhaps into flat cakes or lumps. Then comes the baking, and not just one baking, but two. This double baking process would drive off almost all moisture, making the bapir extremely dry and hard. This had a couple of advantages. Firstly, it made the bapir very stable and resistant to spoilage, allowing it to be stored for long periods. You could make a large quantity of bapir when barley was plentiful after the harvest and store it for brewing throughout the year. It was, in essence, a storable beer ingredient kit. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of those. Just add water pancake mixes, but for booze. Secondly, the baking process itself, especially if the barley was malted, would further develop flavors through Maillard reactions. The same chemical processes that give bread crusts, seared meat, and roasted coffee their delicious brownness and complex aromas. So, bapir wasn't just a bland ingredient. It likely contributed its own toasty, biscuity, or even slightly caramelized notes to the final brew. Historians and archaeobrewers, yes, that's a real thing, people who try to recreate ancient beers based on archaeological and textual evidence. Talk about a cool job. Still debate the exact nature and recipe of bapir. This is our open scholarly debate for this section. Historians still argue whether bapir was primarily made from malted or unmalted barley, or a combination, and what its exact texture and flavor profile truly were. Some fragments of what are believed to be bapir have been found in archaeological contexts, but it's not like finding a perfectly preserved loaf with an ingredients list attached. You're basically looking at ancient, rock-hard cereal bars and trying to reverse engineer a brewery. Once you have your bapir, the next step is to prepare the mash. This involves breaking up the hard bapir bread, probably a fun job involving a lot of banging and cursing, maybe with a wooden mallet or stone tools. You're essentially making bapir crumbs or chunks. These crumbs would then be mixed with water in a large vessel, likely an earthenware pot. Now here's where another key ingredient comes in: malt. While bapir itself might have contained some malt, a separate batch of malted grain, often referred to as munu in Sumerian texts, seems to have been crucial. This munu would be barley, or sometimes emmer wheat, that had been intentionally sprouted and then lightly dried or kilned. The sprouting process, as we discussed, develops the amylase enzymes necessary to convert starches into fermentable sugars. By adding this enzyme-rich munu to the bapir and water mixture, you're ensuring that any remaining starches in the bapir, or in any other adjunct grains added to the mash, are converted into sugars for the yeast to feast upon. So you have your bapir crumbs soaking in water, and you add your crushed munu. This mixture, the mash, would then be left to steep, perhaps with gentle heating, though precise temperature control would have been rudimentary at best. Maybe you'd place the pot near the hearth, or use heated stones dropped into the liquid, a technique known from other ancient brewing traditions. The goal, whether explicitly understood or not, was to allow those enzymes from the munu to do their work, breaking down starches into sugars, creating a sweet, nourishing liquid called wort. You wouldn't have a thermometer to check for the optimal saccharification rest temperature, around 65-70 degrees C, or 150-158 degrees F for modern brewers. So it was probably more a case of leave it till it tastes sweet, or leave it as long as Nana Ninkabab used to. After a period of mashing, the next step is to separate the sweet wort from the spent grain solids, the leftover batter bits and barley husks. This is where things get a bit murky in terms of the exact techniques used. There's no evidence of sophisticated sparging or lautering equipment like modern brewers use. Perhaps they simply allowed the solids to settle and then carefully decanted the liquid off the top. Or maybe they used woven reed mats or cloth as rudimentary filters, pouring the mash through them to collect the wort. Given the likely thickness of the mash, this would have been a messy, inefficient process. A quirky tidbit here. Some scholars suggest that the famous Sumerian drinking straws, often depicted in cylinder seals and found in tombs, were not just for sipping the final beer, but might have also played a role in separating the liquid wort from the grain bed during or after mashing, acting like individual minnelauter tons. You'd stick your long reed or metal straw down into the mash and suck up the sweet liquid, trying to avoid a mouthful of soggy bread. Sounds delightful, doesn't it? Like drinking bubble tea, but the bubbles are ancient barley husks. Once you have your sweet wort, it's time for the magic of fermentation. The wort would be transferred to a fermentation vessel, another large clay pot, and then you wait for the divine transformation. As we've discussed, wild yeasts were the invisible workforce. The wort, rich in sugars, would be an open invitation. The fermentation would likely start spontaneously within a day or two, especially in the warm Mesopotamian climate. Bubbles would appear, a crossin, foamy head would form, and the sweet liquid would gradually become alcoholic and tang. The fermentation process itself would have been a marvel to behold for someone unfamiliar with the science. The bubbling, the changing aromas from sweet to fruity to alcoholic, it would all reinforce the idea that a powerful, unseen force was at work. This is why Ninkasi, the Sumerian goddess of beer, was so important. She wasn't just a patron deity. She was seen as actively participating in the brewing process, guiding the transformation. Brewing was a sacred act, a collaboration with the divine. You're not just mixing ingredients, you're inviting a goddess into your kitchen. Hope Ninkasi's in a good mood today, or this batch is going straight to the pigs. Actually, even bad beer might have been fed to animals, so nothing went to waste. The resulting beer, cash as the Sumerians called it, would have been quite different from modern beers. It would have been unfiltered, hazy, and full of sediment, yeast, proteins, small particles of grain. It would likely have had a relatively low alcohol content, perhaps in the 2–5% ABV range, though this could vary wildly. The flavor profile would be complex and variable, influenced by the wild yeast cocktail, the type of barley, the batter recipe, any added flavorings, and even the clay of the brewing pots. It might have been sour, sweet, bready, or even a bit funky, depending on the batch. It certainly wouldn't have had the bitter hop character we associate with most modern beers, as hops were not used in brewing in Mesopotamia at this time. Any bitterness would have come from the grains themselves, or perhaps other herbs if used. A mainstream historical fact is that the Sumerians didn't just drink their beer. They often consumed it through long straws, typically made of reed, wood, or sometimes precious metals like gold or silver for the elite. These straws are frequently depicted in art, showing people, often two or more, drinking from a large communal jar. The practical reason for these straws was to bypass the layer of solids, spent grain, yeast sediment, bits of batter, that would float on top or settle at the bottom of the unfiltered beer. The straw allowed you to draw the relatively clearer liquid from below the surface scum and above the bottom sludge. It was an ingenious solution to the problem of drinking chunky beer. Imagine trying to politely sip your way through a pint of what is essentially alcoholic, unfiltered soup. The straw makes it all a bit more civilized and less likely to give you a grain husk mustache. The entire process from preparing the batter to mashing, fermenting, and finally drinking Or rather, sipping through a straw was steeped in tradition and ritual. It wasn't just a technical process, it was a cultural performance. The brewer, often a woman in these early periods, Ninkasi herself is a goddess after all, and brewing was often considered a domestic art like baking, held a respected position. She was the guardian of the sacred knowledge, the one who knew how to coax the divine drink from the humble grain. Her brew house, whether a dedicated room in a temple complex or simply a corner of a domestic dwelling, was a place of transformation, a kind of alchemical laboratory where base ingredients were turned into liquid gold. Consider the sensory experience. The smell of baking bapir, toasty and sweet, the sight of the bubbling, fermenting wort alive and active, the sound of grain being crushed, of liquids being poured, the taste of the sweet wort, and then the final, tangy, intoxicating beer. It was an immersive, embodied practice. You weren't just following a recipe, you were engaging all your senses, responding to the subtle cues of the ingredients and the fermentation. The bapir smells right today. The munu looks lively. The bubbling in the pot has that good sound. The tools were simple. Clay pots of various sizes for mashing, fermenting, and serving. Perhaps woven baskets for holding grain or straining. Stone grinders for crushing malt and bapir. Reed mats. And of course, those ubiquitous drinking straws. There were no stainless steel fermenters, no hydrometers, no refractometers, no fancy stir plates for yeast starters. It was all done with natural materials, human skill, and a healthy dose of hope and prayer. You'd probably trade your best goat for a roll of plastic wrap to keep the flies out of the fermenter. But alas, cling film is also a few thousand years away. The scale of production would have varied. Household brewing for domestic consumption was likely common, but larger establishments, particularly temples and palaces, would have had dedicated breweries producing beer on a much larger scale, as beer was used for rations, for religious ceremonies, and for feasting. These industrial breweries would have had larger vessels, more organized processes, and perhaps specialized brewers. We find archaeological evidence of such facilities, with pottery shards showing beer residue, and layouts consistent with brewing operations. The leftover grains from the mashing process, the spent grains, wouldn't have been wasted either. They were still nutritious and could be used as animal feed, or even in times of scarcity, incorporated into human food. Waste not, want not was a harsh reality. Every part of the process, every byproduct, had a potential use. So the journey from barley bread to the divine drink cash was a multi-step, carefully managed by ancient standards process. It involved specific ingredients like bapir and munu, particular techniques for mashing and fermentation, and a deep cultural understanding of the transformative power of this beverage. It wasn't just oops, the porridge fermented again. It was a craft, an art, a sacred duty. You, as an ancient Sumerian, are now privy to these brewhouse secrets, watching as mere grain and water are transmuted into something that nourishes the body, gladdens the heart, and connects you to the divine. The mystery is still there. The hand of Ninkasi is still felt, but you're also learning to guide that hand, to become a co-creator of this wondrous liquid. And as you drift off, perhaps you can almost smell the sweet, malty aroma of the mash, or hear the gentle bubbling of the fermenting cash, a sound that has echoed through Sumerian homes and temples for centuries. The transition from purely accidental fermentation to a more controlled, recipe-driven approach, even if that recipe was orally transmitted and subject to variation, marks a significant step in the story of beer. It's about taking that initial spark of discovery and nurturing it into a repeatable, reliable, semi-reliable process. You're moving from being a passive observer of nature's magic to an active participant, a proto-brewer. Let's delve deeper into the ingredients. We've mentioned bapir and munu. The quality of your barley itself would be paramount. You'd want plump, healthy grains. After harvest, the barley would need to be threshed and winnowed carefully to remove chaff and straw. Any dirt or contaminants could negatively affect the brew. You're not thinking about wild bacteria or mold spores in a scientific sense, but you know from experience that clean grain makes better beer. Don't use the barley that the rats nested in. It makes the cash taste like, well, rats. The creation of munu, malted grain, is particularly fascinating because it shows a sophisticated, albeit empirical, understanding of grain chemistry. To make munu, you take your barley, steep it in water to raise the moisture content, and then spread it out in a relatively warm, damp place to germinate. You're essentially tricking the grain into thinking it's time to sprout into a new plant. As it begins to germinate, it produces those vital amylase enzymes. You have to watch it carefully. If it sprouts too much, it uses up too much of its stored energy. If it doesn't sprout enough, you don't get enough enzyme activity. It's a delicate balance, learned through generations of practice. Once the barley has sprouted to the desired degree, judged by the length of the acrospire, the little shoot growing under the husk, though you'd be judging by feel and appearance, not by textbook diagrams, you need to halt the germination. This is done by drying the malt. In Mesopotamia, with its abundant sunshine, open-air drying would have been common, or it might have been lightly kilned in ovens, which could also impart some toasted or roasted flavors to the malt, depending on the temperature and duration. Different kilning regimens would produce malts with different characteristics, though the Sumerians wouldn't have had the fine control of a modern maltster. Their kilning might have been as simple as spreading the germinated grain on hot stones or in a clay oven after the bread baking was done, using the residual heat. The resulting munu would then be crushed, not too finely, not too coarsely, before being added to the mash. The Bapir bread itself, as the other main component, is intriguing. Why bread? Why not just use all malted grain in the mash, as many modern brewers do? One theory is that Bapir, being twice baked and very dry, was a way of preserving the brewing potential of the grain over long periods. Malt, once crushed, can lose its enzymatic power over time if not stored properly. Bapir, as a baked product, might have been more stable. Another theory is that the Bapir contributed unique flavors and textures. The process of making a dough and baking it could create different compounds than simply mashing raw or malted grain. It might also have helped with clarity or head retention in the final beer, though this is speculative. The actual brewing process after preparing your ingredients would start with the mash. Imagine a large clay pot, your mash tun. You'd crumble in your Bapir, add your crushed munu, and then mix in hot water. The temperature of this water was crucial, even if not precisely measured. Too cold and the enzymes work too slowly or not at all. Too hot and you can denature, destroy the enzymes. They would have learned by feel, by the steam rising, or by time-tested methods like adding a certain number of heated stones to a specific volume of water to achieve the right warmth. 3 hot rocks for a small pot, 5 for the big one, unless it's windy. Then add 1 more for Ninkasi's good humor. The mash would sit for a period, allowing the enzymes to convert starches to sugars. This sweet wort is the heart of the beer. Then the separation. This is still a bit of a puzzle. Perhaps they used large, shallow dishes and let the grain settle, then carefully ladled or tipped the liquid off. Or, as mentioned, reed mats or coarse cloth could have acted as simple sieves. It would have been inefficient by our standards. A lot of the sweet wort might have remained trapped in the spent grains. But efficiency wasn't the primary concern. Getting a drinkable, enjoyable product was. Once the wort was separated, it went into the fermentation vessel. Again, a large clay pot, perhaps one known for producing good results, our lucky pot with its resident yeast culture. No yeast was deliberately pitched in the way modern brewers add a specific strain. The wort was simply exposed to the air, or perhaps a small amount of actively fermenting beer from a previous successful batch was added, a primitive form of backslopping, or pitching by contact, which could help establish a more consistent microbial population. The fermentation would be wild and vigorous, especially in the Mesopotamian heat. The pot might be covered with a cloth or a reed mat to keep out insects and too much dust, but it wouldn't be airtight. Carbon dioxide, a byproduct of fermentation, would bubble away. The temperature of the fermentation would be largely uncontrolled, fluctuating with the ambient temperature. This would also contribute to the variability of the final beer, as different yeasts and bacteria thrive at different temperatures, producing different flavor compounds. A hot fermentation might lead to more fruity esters or spicy fusel alcohols. A cooler fermentation might be cleaner but slower. You just have to take what the gods and the local microflora gave you. The duration of fermentation would also vary. It might be considered ready when the bubbling slowed down, or after a set number of days based on tradition, or simply when it tasted right. There was no concept of measuring specific gravity to determine if fermentation was complete. It was all sensory evaluation. Does it taste less sweet than yesterday? Does it have that nice tingle? Good, it's ready. Don't let grog drink it all. And what about flavorings? While hops were not used, it's plausible that other plants or ingredients were added to the beer for flavor, aroma, preservation, though likely ineffective, or ritual purposes. Dates with their high sugar content could have been added to boost fermentation or add sweetness and flavor. Honey, a precious commodity, might have been used in special brews. Spices and herbs known from Mesopotamian cuisine and medicine could also have found their way into the beer. Things like coriander, juniper, fenugreek, or various local aromatic plants might have been used, much like the gruit mixtures used in European brewing before the widespread adoption of hops. However, direct textual or archaeological evidence for specific flavorings in the earliest Sumerian beers is limited, making it an area of ongoing research and speculation. It's another one of those things where you wish you could just ask a Sumerian brewer. So, what's your secret ingredient? Don't worry, I won't tell the Akkadians. The vessels themselves are important. Sumerian pottery was functional but could also be decorated. Large brewing and serving pots are known from archaeological sites. The porosity of the earthenware, while potentially harboring yeast, also meant that some evaporation could occur, and cleaning the pots thoroughly would have been a challenge. Imagine trying to scrub dried bapir residue and yeast gunk from the inside of a giant clay jar with no bottle brush or modern detergents. You'd probably use sand and water, or a bundle of stiff reeds. The brew house itself, whether a dedicated area in a temple or palace, or just a part of a domestic dwelling, would have been a place of constant activity. The air would be filled with the smells of grain, baking bread, sweet wort, and fermenting beer. It would have been warm, damp, and probably quite messy. Not exactly a gleaming, stainless steel modern brewery, but a functional space for an essential craft. The knowledge of brewing was valuable. While women were often the brewers in domestic settings, specialized brewers, perhaps both male and female, would have worked in larger establishments. This knowledge was passed down, likely within families or through apprenticeships. It was a skilled trade, requiring experience, intuition, and a certain reverence for the process. You weren't just following steps. You were interpreting signs, making adjustments based on the feel of the dough, the smell of the mash, the look of the ferment. It was an organic, living process. So these ancient brewhouse secrets, pieced together from fragments of texts and archaeological clues, paint a picture of a sophisticated craft, deeply embedded in Sumerian society. It was a process that transformed humble barley into a divine elixir, a staple food, a social lubricant, and a sacred offering. You, drifting back in time, can almost feel the heat from the baking ovens, hear the rhythmic grinding of grain, and anticipate the moment when the first frothy, fragrant cash is drawn from the fermentation jar. It's a tradition in the making, a secret whispered from one generation to the next, a taste of civilization itself. Now that you've peeked into the somewhat sticky and fragrant secrets of the ancient Sumerian brew house, let's pull back a bit and see how this cash, this divine barley brew, flowed through the veins of daily Sumerian life. It wasn't just a special occasion beverage reserved for kings and priests, though they certainly enjoyed their share, and probably the best batches too. Beer was deeply woven into the social, economic, and even nutritional fabric of society, from the grandest ziggurat to the humblest reed hut. You'd be hard-pressed to find an aspect of Sumerian existence where beer didn't make at least a cameo appearance. It was, quite literally, the taste of daily life. One of the most striking aspects of beer's role in Sumerian society, a mainstream historical fact that often surprises people, is its use as a form of payment or ration. Cuneiform tablets, those wonderfully preserved little clay rectangles covered in wedge-shaped writing, provide a wealth of information about the administration and economy of Sumerian city-states. And what do they tell us? That workers, from temple laborers to canal diggers to government officials, were often paid, at least in part, with rations of barley and beer. Think about that. Your monthly paycheck isn't direct deposit. It's a few sacks of grain and a couple of jars of beer. Honey, I'm home. Got the barley, and the good news is, this month's beer ration doesn't taste like Guck's old sandals. These ration lists, meticulously recorded by temple and palace scribes, who probably also received their share of beer for their troubles, detail different payment tiers. A high-ranking official might receive several liters of beer per day, along with a generous allotment of barley, oil, and wool. A common laborer might receive a smaller but still significant amount, perhaps 1 or 2 liters of beer. This wasn't seen as just a perk. It was a fundamental part of their compensation, their daily sustenance. The beer provided calories, hydration, often safer than questionable water sources, as the fermentation process killed some pathogens and essential B vitamins. In a society without widespread currency, commodities like grain and beer were the bedrock of the economy. Imagine you're part of a crew working on one of the massive public works projects, digging an irrigation canal to bring water to new farmlands, or hauling mud bricks for the construction of a temple to Inanna or Enlil. It's grueling, back-breaking labor under the relentless Mesopotamian sun. Your energy levels are flagging. Then, the ration distributor comes around with your daily allotment of bread and beer. That cool, slightly tangy, nourishing cash would have been more than just a drink. It would have been a vital source of energy, a moment of refreshment, and a well-deserved reward for your toil. It's hard to imagine a modern construction site offering beer breaks, but in Sumer, it was just part of the deal. Probably cut down on afternoon grumbling, too. Beyond its role as wages, beer was a ubiquitous social lubricant. Sumerian art, particularly cylinder seals, small, intricately carved stone cylinders that were rolled onto wet clay to create a repeating impression, often used as signatures or to mark property, frequently depicts scenes of feasting and drinking. These images show people, often in pairs or small groups, gathered around a large jar of beer, sipping through those characteristic long straws. These aren't necessarily wild, raucous parties, though those probably happen too, but often portray a sense of communal enjoyment and social interaction. Taverns, or at least establishments that functioned in a similar way, also existed in Sumerian cities. These might have been run by alewives, often women who brewed and sold beer. The Sumerians even had a term for a female tavern keeper, sabatu. These taverns would have been places where people could gather after a day's work, exchange news and gossip, make business deals, or simply relax and enjoy a drink with friends. You can imagine the atmosphere, dimly lit by oil lamps, the air thick with the smell of beer and perhaps roasting meat, the murmur of conversation, punctuated by laughter or the clinking of clay cups, though straws were more common for communal jars. It's a scene that would be recognizable in many cultures throughout history. Another round for my friend Lugal here, Sabatu. He just closed a big deal on 3 prime sheep and he's feeling generous, or he will be after a few more sips. Of course, where there's alcohol, there's also the potential for overindulgence and its associated problems. While beer was a daily staple, Sumerian texts also contain warnings about the dangers of excessive drinking. Wisdom literature, a genre of writing that offered advice on proper conduct, sometimes cautioned against spending too much time in taverns or becoming a drunkard. One proverb warns, "He who drinks too much beer must drink water." Another, rather more colorfully, describes the ill effects of too much beer on a person's speech and judgment. So, they were well aware that while beer could be a blessing, it could also lead to trouble if not consumed in moderation. The concept of a designated donkey cart driver probably hadn't emerged yet, so you were on your own if you overdid it. Beer also played a significant role in hospitality. Offering a guest beer was a sign of welcome and respect. When travelers arrived, or when friends visited, sharing a jar of cash would have been a customary part of social etiquette. It was a way of forging bonds, strengthening relationships, and demonstrating generosity. Imagine turning up at someone's mud brick house after a long, dusty journey and being greeted with a refreshing drink of cool beer. It would have been incredibly welcome. In the home, beer was a regular part of the family diet. It wasn't just for the men working in the fields or on construction projects. Women and even children likely consumed weaker, less alcoholic versions of beer, or beer mixed with water. Given the nutritional value of unfiltered beer, it would have been a sensible addition to everyone's diet, especially when other food sources might be scarce or monotonous. It was liquid bread, after all. You might not give your toddler a pint of strong ale today, but a low-alcohol, nutrient-rich barley beverage. That might have been a different story in ancient Sumer. Let's consider the quirky tidbit for this section. While we know beer was made from barley and sometimes emmer wheat, Sumerian texts occasionally mention different types or grades of beer, distinguished by names that perhaps indicated their strength, color, or quality. We have terms like golden beer, dark beer, sweet dark beer, and strong beer. What exactly differentiated these types is not always clear. Was golden beer made with lighter malts or filtered more carefully? Was dark beer made with more heavily roasted vapor or different grains? Was strong beer simply fermented longer or made with a higher proportion of grain to water? These are questions that keep archaeo-brewers and cuneiform scholars busy. It suggests a level of brewing sophistication beyond just making one generic type of cash. Perhaps you could even be a beer snob in ancient Ur. Oh, you're drinking the common dark beer. I only touch the triple-strength sweet golden, darling. It pairs so much better with roasted gazelle. The economics of beer production and distribution were also complex. While much brewing happened at a household level, temples and palaces were major centers of production. These institutions controlled vast agricultural lands, collected grain as taxes or offerings, and had the resources to brew on a large scale. This beer was then used to pay their numerous dependents, priests, administrators, soldiers, craftsmen, laborers. It was a vertically integrated system. The temple grew the barley, brewed the beer, and paid its workers with it. Some of this beer might also have been traded, either locally or perhaps even with neighboring regions, though transporting large quantities of a relatively low-value, perishable liquid like beer would have been challenging. Solid vapor, the beer bread, might have been a more practical trade good if you wanted to export your brewing know-how. The prevalence of beer in daily life is also reflected in Sumerian mythology and religion, which we will explore more in the next section. But even outside of formal religious contexts, beer had a kind of everyday sacredness. It came from the grain, which was a gift from the gods. Its production was overseen by the goddess Ninkasi. Its consumption was often communal, fostering a sense of shared experience. This wasn't just a profane beverage. It was imbued with a deeper cultural and spiritual significance. Think about the legal aspects. While we don't have extensive beer laws from the earliest Sumerian period, later Mesopotamian law codes, like the famous Code of Hammurabi, from the Babylonian period, but building on Sumerian legal traditions, do include regulations related to taverns and the sale of beer. For example, tavern keepers who overcharged for beer or allowed seditious talk in their establishments could face harsh penalties, even death. This indicates that the authorities recognized the social importance of beer and the places where it was consumed, and sought to regulate them. You wouldn't want your local pub becoming a hotbed of anti-government sentiment, fueled by cheap beer and loose tongues. Beer was also likely used in various everyday rituals and celebrations, births, marriages, deaths, harvest festivals. Any occasion that brought the community together would have been an occasion for sharing beer. It helped to mark significant life events and reinforce social bonds. It was part of the rhythm of life, from cradle to grave. Your first taste might have been a very weak beer as a child, and your funeral rites might involve offerings of beer to ensure your safe passage to the afterlife. So when you picture a bustling Sumerian city like Ur or Uruk, with its winding alleyways, its crowded marketplaces, its grand temples, imagine the constant presence of beer, the aroma of brewing drifting from homes and temple workshops, the sight of workers receiving their daily beer rations, the sound of conversations and laughter from a local tavern, the taste of cool, nourishing cash shared among family and friends. It was more than just a drink. It was a currency, a food, a social catalyst, a fundamental part of what it meant to be Sumerian. You're not just observing history here. You're immersed in a world where beer was as essential as bread, as vital as water. And as you continue to drift and relax, let the gentle flow of this ancient barley brew carry you deeper into the heart of Sumerian life. The daily grind wasn't so much a grind if it ended with a cool sip from a communal jar, surrounded by your comrades, under the watchful eyes of the gods. The ubiquity of beer as a daily staple raises questions about its strength and how people managed to function. Most scholars agree that the everyday cash was likely quite low in alcohol, perhaps comparable to what was later known as small beer in Europe, a beverage brewed to be hydrating and nutritious rather than primarily intoxicating. It would have been consumed throughout the day by people of all ages, much like water or other beverages. Stronger beers with higher alcohol content were probably also brewed, but these might have been reserved for special occasions, religious festivals, or for the elite who could afford to indulge more heavily. You wouldn't want your canal diggers showing up for work already half seas over from their breakfast beer. All right, lads, try to dig the canal straight this time. Yes, I'm looking at you, Enugi, you and your extra strength morning brew. The ration system is particularly fascinating because it tells us so much about Sumerian social organization. The precise accounting on clay tablets, so much barley, so much beer, so much oil for individuals based on their rank and role points to a highly organized, bureaucratic society, even at this early stage of civilization. It wasn't a haphazard distribution. It was a calculated system of remuneration and resource management. The temple or palace acted as a kind of central redistribution hub, collecting agricultural surplus and doling it out to support a complex society with specialized labor. Beer, in this context, is an economic indicator, a tool of social control, and a means of sustaining the workforce. Consider the logistics. If a large temple complex employed thousands of workers, providing each with a daily beer ration meant a significant brewing operation. There would need to be dedicated brewers, storage facilities for barley and bapir, a constant supply of fresh water, and numerous fermentation and serving vessels. It was a major industry, integrated into the core functions of the state. Archaeologists have uncovered what appear to be large-scale brewing facilities in Mesopotamian sites, with rows of vats and evidence of grain processing, lending physical support to what the texts describe. The tavern, or Ashdam, literally house of the drink beer in some interpretations, or referring to the alewife, as a social institution is also worth pondering. These weren't just drinking dens, they were hubs of social life. In a society where many people lived in relatively small, perhaps crowded dwellings, the tavern offered a communal space. Here you could escape the confines of your home, meet people from different walks of life, hear news from travelers, or just unwind. The alewife, or sabitude, who ran the establishment, was often a figure of some importance, and sometimes a target of suspicion. She was a businesswoman, a purveyor of a potentially troublesome commodity, and her establishment could be a place where social norms were a bit more relaxed. The Code of Hammurabi, for instance, has laws concerning alewives who cheat customers on the price of beer or harbor criminals in their establishments. This shows that taverns were common enough and potentially problematic enough to warrant legal attention. Right, Urudu. Your tab is 3 shekels for the beer and an extra 2 for not telling the watchman you were hiding here. The open scholarly debate for this section could revolve around the exact social standing and autonomy of female brewers and tavern keepers, Sabbatu, in Sumerian society. While brewing was often women's work, and Ninkasi was a goddess, did this translate into genuine economic power and independence for women involved in beer production and sales? Or were they still largely constrained by a patriarchal social structure? Texts and depictions are open to interpretation, and it's a lively area of discussion in gender studies and Assyriology. Were these entrepreneurial women challenging norms, or simply fulfilling an accepted female role? The consumption of beer through straws from a communal jar is also culturally significant. It emphasizes the shared, communal aspect of drinking. It wasn't necessarily about individual portions in separate cups, though individual cups were also used, especially for wine later on. The large jar was the centerpiece, and people gathered around it, sharing the same drink from the same vessel. This act of sharing would have reinforced social cohesion and equality, at least within the drinking group. Imagine the conversations, the stories, the jokes shared over that communal pot, each person with their long reed straw. It's a very different social dynamic than everyone having their own pint glass. You're literally all in it together. Let's think about the sheer volume of beer being consumed. If an average worker received, say, 1 sila, roughly 1 liter of beer per day, and there were thousands of such workers in a major city plus consumption by other members of society, the total amount of beer brewed and drunk daily would have been enormous. This implies that a significant portion of the barley harvest was dedicated to brewing. It wasn't just a sideline. It was a major agricultural and industrial undertaking. This also highlights the incredible productivity of Mesopotamian agriculture, fueled by irrigation from the Tigris and Euphrates, which could produce enough surplus grain to support such widespread beer production. And what about the taste and variety available to the average Sumerian punter on their daily beer run? While the elite might have had access to special brews, the everyday cache was likely a fairly standard if variable product. It would have been cloudy, perhaps a bit sour, due to lactic acid bacteria from the mixed fermentation, bready, and only mildly alcoholic. It probably wouldn't win any gold medals at a modern craft beer festival, but for the Sumerians, it was familiar, nourishing, and enjoyable. It was their daily drinker. You probably wouldn't write poetry about its complex hop aroma, since there weren't any hops, but you might praise its ability to quench your thirst and lift your spirits after a hard day's work. The connection between beer and food is also vital. Beer wasn't just drunk alongside meals. It was a meal, or at least a significant part of one. The residual grain and yeast in unfiltered beer provided protein, fiber, and vitamins. This made it an important nutritional safety net, especially for the poorer segments of society whose diets might otherwise be deficient. This is a far cry from the empty calories, often associated with some modern alcoholic beverages. Sumerian beer was a functional food. You're not just getting a buzz, you're getting your B-vits and a bit of roughage. Probably kept the Sumerian digestive system surprisingly regular, despite all the barley. The daily pint, or rather, the daily sila drawn through a straw, was therefore a cornerstone of Sumerian life. It fueled the workforce, lubricated social interactions, provided essential nutrients, and played a role in the economic machinery of the early city-states. It was a constant, familiar presence, from the fields where the barley grew to the taverns where stories were told, to the homes where families gathered. As you settle deeper into relaxation, imagine the gentle rhythm of this daily life, punctuated by the sharing of cash, a simple pleasure, a profound necessity. It's a world away from ours, yet the human desire for sustenance, companionship, and a moment of respite remains timeless. And for the Sumerians, beer helped provide all three. Having explored the daily grind and the social sips of Sumerian beer, we now turn our gaze upwards, towards the heavens, or at least towards the ziggurats, to understand the sacred role of cash. Beer wasn't just a mundane commodity or a social lubricant. It was deeply intertwined with Sumerian religion, mythology, and ritual practice. The transformative power of fermentation, turning simple grain into an intoxicating beverage, was seen as nothing short of divine intervention. And who better to oversee this miracle than a dedicated deity? Enter Ninkasi, the Sumerian goddess of beer, brewing, and alcohol. Her name literally means the lady who fills the mouth. A rather fitting title, don't you think, for a goddess of such a popular libation? You don't get a much clearer job description than that. The most famous tribute to Ninkasi, and a crucial source for understanding Sumerian brewing practices, is the hymn to Ninkasi. This beautiful piece of Sumerian literature, dating back to around 1800 BCE, though the traditions it describes are likely much older, is part recipe, part poem, part paean of praise to the goddess. It's a mainstream historical fact that this hymn is one of our most detailed ancient texts describing brewing techniques. It doesn't just vaguely mention beer. It outlines in poetic form the steps involved in its creation, from the preparation of bapir and munu to the final filtering and serving of the cash. Let's imagine you're a temple scribe, carefully pressing your stylus into a soft clay tablet, recording the words of this hymn as it's recited, perhaps during a brewing festival or a ceremony honoring Ninkasi. The language is evocative, filled with imagery of flowing waters, sacred vessels, and the goddess herself overseeing the process. Ninkasi, you are the one who handles dough and with a big shovel, mixing in a pit the bapir with sweet aromatics. Ninkasi, you are the one who bakes the bapir in the big oven, puts in order the piles of hulled grains. The hymn continues, step by step, the soaking of the malt, the spreading of the mash, the use of noble dogs, which some scholars interpret as a poetic term for the stirring paddles or tools, rather than actual canines assisting in the brewery, though a helpful brewery dog fetching your slippers after a long day of mashing sounds quite nice. It describes the wort as like the Tigris and Euphrates, flowing into the collecting vessel. Then comes the fermentation. Ninkasi, you are the one who pours out the filtered beer of the collector vat. It is like the onrush of Tigris and Euphrates. The hymn doesn't just detail the process, it imbues it with sacredness. Each step is an act of devotion, guided by Ninkasi. She is the ultimate brewmaster, the divine alchemist. When you drank beer brewed according to these sacred methods, you weren't just consuming a beverage, you were partaking in a divine creation, a gift from the goddess. It's like having Gordon Ramsay personally bless your risotto, but with much higher cosmic stakes. Ninkasi herself was a significant deity in the Sumerian pantheon, though perhaps not as powerful as the great gods like Anu sky, Enlil air, or Enki water and wisdom. She was often depicted as a nurturing, life-giving figure, associated with fertility and abundance, much like the grains from which her beer was made. She was the daughter of Enki, the clever god of wisdom, crafts, and magic, which makes sense. Brewing, with its mysterious transformations, certainly seemed like a kind of magic. Her temples, or at least shrines dedicated to her, would have been places of active brewing, where the sacred cash was prepared for rituals and offerings. And offerings of beer were indeed a crucial part of Sumerian religious practice. Just as humans enjoyed beer, it was believed that the gods also appreciated a good brew. Beer was regularly presented to the statues of deities in temples as part of the daily ritual meal. Imagine a priest or priestess carefully pouring out a measure of freshly brewed cash into a sacred vessel before the image of a god, accompanied by hymns and prayers. It was a way of honoring the gods, seeking their favor, and ensuring their continued benevolence towards the city and its people. Here you go, mighty Inanna, a fresh batch of the good stuff. Now about that bumper barley harvest we were hoping for. Beer also played a role in various religious festivals and celebrations. These events, often tied to the agricultural cycle, like planting or harvest festivals, or significant mythological events, would involve feasting, music, dancing, and of course, the consumption of beer, often in copious amounts. These were times when the boundaries between the sacred and the profane might blur, when the entire community came together to celebrate and honor the gods. The intoxicating effects of beer could even be seen as a way to achieve a state of altered consciousness, allowing participants to feel closer to the divine, to experience a sense of ecstasy or communion. Your slightly tipsy conga lying around the ziggurat might just be a deeply spiritual experience. Beyond formal temple rituals, beer was likely used in more personal or household religious practices. Offerings of beer might be made to household gods or ancestral spirits. It might be used in purification rites or healing rituals. Its transformative properties, turning grain into a mood-altering beverage, lent itself to symbolic interpretations related to life, death, and rebirth. A quirky tidbit for this section relates to the mythological origins of brewing. While Ninkasi was the goddess of beer, the god Enki, her father, often gets credit in Sumerian myths for the invention or discovery of many essential elements of civilization, including, sometimes implicitly, the knowledge of brewing. One myth tells of Enki getting into a drinking contest with the goddess Ninhursag, or another deity, depending on the version, where they create various beings while intoxicated. This not only highlights the long-standing association of beer with both creativity and foolishness, but also ties beer's origins to the highest echelons of the divine. It suggests that beer wasn't just a human invention but a gift, perhaps even an accidental byproduct of divine revelry, passed down to mortals. Imagine the gods having a particularly wild party, and the next morning, humanity wakes up with the recipe for beer and a divine hangover. The priests and priestesses who served in the temples and oversaw the religious rituals would have been deeply involved in beer production and consumption. Temple breweries were important institutions, not just for supplying the gods' offerings, but also for providing rations to temple personnel and for use in festivals. The knowledge of brewing, especially the recipes and rituals for sacred beers, would have been carefully guarded and passed down within the priestly class. Being a temple brewer was a position of considerable skill and religious importance. You weren't just making drinks, you were crafting offerings for the gods themselves. No pressure. The use of beer in funerary rites is another significant aspect. Sumerians believed in an afterlife, a rather gloomy underworld called Kur. Offerings of food and drink, including beer, were often placed in tombs to sustain the deceased on their journey to the netherworld and to appease the gods of the underworld. The famous royal tombs of Ur, dating to around 2600–2500 BCE, contained lavish grave goods, including vessels that likely held beer, and even drinking straws made of gold and silver. This shows that beer was considered essential not just for life, but also for death. You wouldn't want to face eternity without a decent supply of your favorite beverage. Don't forget to pack Uncle Urzababa's favorite dark beer for the trip, and his lucky drinking straw. The open scholarly debate for this section could be, to what extent did the psychoactive effects of beer in religious rituals genuinely facilitate mystical experiences, versus simply being a socially sanctioned form of intoxication within a religious framework? Were participants truly communing with the divine, or were they just enjoying a divinely approved party? It's a difficult question, as it touches on the nature of religious experience itself, and how it might be influenced by psychoactive substances. Anthropologists and historians of religion continue to explore this fascinating intersection. The very ingredients of beer, barley, and water were themselves sacred. Barley was the lifeblood of Sumerian agriculture, a gift from the earth, personified by deities like Ashnet, the grain goddess. Water, especially the life-giving waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, was associated with Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh waters. So when these sacred elements were combined and transformed through the divinely guided process of fermentation, The resulting beer was triply sacred. It was a potent symbol of life, abundance, and divine power. Architecture of the temples, the ziggurats reaching towards the sky, would have been the backdrop for many of these beer-related rituals. Imagine a grand procession during a festival, carrying jars of sacred beer up the ziggurat steps to the shrine at the top, the air filled with music and incense. The consumption of this beer in such a sacred space, by priests and perhaps by lay participants, would have been a powerful, multi-sensory experience, reinforcing their connection to the gods and the cosmic order. Even the vessels used for brewing and serving sacred beer might have been specially consecrated or decorated with religious motifs. The act of drinking from a communal jar, using straws, as depicted in many ritual scenes, further emphasized the collective nature of these religious experiences. It wasn't just an individual communing with their god. It was the community as a whole participating in the divine feast. The stories and myths of Sumer also featured beer. Gods were often depicted feasting and drinking. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, though compiled later, it draws on Sumerian sources. The wild man Enkidu is civilized, in part, by being introduced to bread and beer. After drinking 7 goblets of beer, his heart expands, his face glows, and he becomes like a human. This episode beautifully illustrates the Sumerian view of beer as an essential element of civilized life, distinguishing humans from wild beasts. It's not just about getting drunk, it's about participating in culture. Beer literally makes Enkidu more human, more sociable, more Sumerian. If you want to join the club of civilization, you better learn to appreciate a good brew. So Ninkasi's hymn wasn't just a quaint poem, it was a sacred text, a testament to the divine origins and profound religious importance of beer in Sumerian culture. From daily offerings in the temples to large-scale festival consumption, from funerary rites to mythological narratives, cash was a constant companion on the Sumerian spiritual journey. It was a way to honor the gods, to connect with the divine, and to celebrate the blessings of life. As you continue to relax and drift, imagine the sounds of chanting from a Sumerian temple, the scent of incense mixed with the aroma of sacred beer, and the comforting presence of Ninkasi, the lady who fills the mouth, ensuring that both gods and mortals have their fill of her divine brew. The line between the earthly and the divine was often pleasantly blurred, especially after a few well-brewed sips. The reverence for Ninkasi and the integration of beer into religious life highlight a worldview where the mundane and the magical were not strictly separated. The natural process of fermentation, mysterious as it was, became a symbol of divine creativity and generosity. When your crops grew well and your beer fermented successfully, it was a sign that the gods were pleased. If the harvest failed or a batch of beer went sour, it might be interpreted as divine displeasure, prompting prayers and perhaps more elaborate offerings. Maybe the gods preferred a stronger brew that week. Consider the temple brewery. This wouldn't have been just a functional production facility. It would have been a sacred space, perhaps with its own rituals and protocols for brewing the beer destined for the gods. The brewers themselves might have undergone purification rites before undertaking their tasks. The ingredients would be carefully selected, perhaps from a portion of the harvest specifically consecrated to the temple. The entire process, from grinding the malt to pouring the finished beer, would be carried out with a sense of reverence. You're not just punching a clock at the divine brewery, you're performing a sacred duty. Make sure the bapir for Anu's offering is twice baked to perfection, and don't let that apprentice, Lugal the Clumsy, anywhere near Ninkasi's special fermentation vats. The different types of beer mentioned in text, golden, dark, sweet, might also have had specific ritual uses. Perhaps a particular type of beer was favored by a certain god or used for a specific festival. The menu for the gods could have been quite varied. This implies a sophisticated understanding of brewing, allowing for the creation of distinct styles, not just a generic temple brew. The divine palate was clearly discerning. The act of offering beer to the gods wasn't just about giving them a drink. It was part of a reciprocal relationship. Humans provided the gods with sustenance, food, drink, incense, praise, and in return, the gods provided humans with life, prosperity, and order. Beer was a tangible link in this cosmic chain of reciprocity. It was a way of saying, we acknowledge your power and generosity, and we offer back to you the fruits of the earth, transformed by sacred knowledge. The role of beer in divination is another intriguing possibility, though less directly documented than offerings. In many ancient cultures, altered states of consciousness, whether induced by fasting, chanting, dancing, or psychoactive substances, were seen as a way to receive messages from the gods or to foresee the future. While Sumerian divination more commonly involved practices like observing the livers of sacrificed animals, hepatoscopy, or interpreting astronomical omens, it's conceivable that the intoxicating effects of beer, especially stronger brews consumed in a ritual context, could have played a role in inducing trance-like states or visions for certain individuals. This is speculative, but given the widespread use of mind-altering substances in religious contexts globally, it's not an unreasonable thought. After 7 cups of Ninkasi's special reserve, the priest suddenly declared that next Tuesday would be a good day for fishing. And he was right, mostly. The hymns, prayers, and myths associated with beer and brewing serve to reinforce these cultural values and transmit them across generations. By reciting the hymn to Ninkasi, you weren't just learning a recipe, you were internalizing a whole cosmology, a way of understanding your place in the world and your relationship with the divine. The stories of gods drinking and feasting normalized the consumption of beer and elevated its status. It was something that even the highest beings enjoyed, so it must be good. Think about the sheer amount of human effort, ingenuity, and faith that went into ensuring a steady supply of beer for both divine and mortal consumption. From the farmers tilling the fields, to the women grinding the grain and baking the bapir, to the brewers tending their bubbling vats, to the priests performing the sacred rites. It was a collective endeavor, all centered around this remarkable beverage. The sacredness of beer also extended to the social norms surrounding its consumption. While taverns might have been places for more boisterous enjoyment, even there, a certain respect for the drink and its power was likely maintained. Spilling beer, for example, might have been seen as unlucky or disrespectful to Ninkasi. Sharing beer from a communal jar fostered a sense of brotherhood and mutual respect. These unwritten rules and customs, woven into the fabric of daily life, underscored the cultural importance of catch. So, as you let your mind wander through the temple courtyards and brewery workshops of ancient Sumer, remember that for these people, beer was far more than just an alcoholic drink. It was a divine gift, a sacred substance, a key ingredient in their relationship with the gods and with each other. Ninkasi's gentle, bubbling presence was felt in every pot of fermenting catch, and her blessings were sought with every sip. It's a comforting thought, perhaps, that even in the earliest days of civilization, people found solace, joy, and a touch of the divine in a humble mug, or rather, a reed straw dipped into a communal jar of beer. The gods were happy, the people were happy, and the beer kept flowing. Sweet dreams, indeed. We've journeyed from the first accidental sips of fermented grain, through the secrets of the Sumerian brew house, and into the daily lives and sacred rituals where cash flowed freely. Now, as our sleepy exploration of Sumerian beer nears its end, let's look at how this ancient tradition was enjoyed by the elite, how it was regulated, and what lasting legacy it left, trickling down through the millennia like the last drops from a ceremonial jar. Even kings and queens, it turns out, appreciated a well-brewed pint, or whatever the royal equivalent was, probably served in a nicer cup at least. In the palaces of Sumerian city-states, beer was undoubtedly a staple, just as it was for the common folk, but with a touch more refinement and perhaps a wider variety. Kings, queens, high officials, and wealthy merchants would have had access to the best quality brews. Perhaps these were the golden beers, or sweet dark beers mentioned in texts, crafted with finer ingredients, more careful brewing techniques, and maybe even aged for a smoother taste. Though aging beer in porous clay pots in a hot climate presents its own challenges. Think less cellared vintage, and more hope it doesn't turn to vinegar by next week. You can imagine the royal brewer, a highly skilled artisan, taking immense pride in producing cash fit for the king's table. One bad batch and it might not just be your job on the line, but possibly your neck. The king found your latest strong beer a bit weak, brewer, and he wants to know why it tastes faintly of swamp water. You have one more chance. Feasts and banquets in the royal courts would have been lavish affairs, with copious amounts of food and, naturally, beer. Cylinder seals and stone carvings often depict banquet scenes with seated dignitaries, musicians, and servants attending to the guests, who are, of course, shown sipping from large beer jars through their elegant straws. These straws, for the elite, were not just simple reeds. They could be crafted from bronze, silver, or even gold, sometimes intricately decorated. The famous Puabi's tomb in Ur, belonging to a queen or high priestess from around 2600 BCE, contained exquisite examples of such luxury drinking equipment. Drinking beer wasn't just about quenching thirst or getting a buzz. For the elite, it was also about displaying status and wealth through the quality of the beer and the opulence of the drinking paraphernalia. Your golden straw wasn't just functional, it was bling. Beyond simple enjoyment, beer also played a role in diplomacy and statecraft. Offering fine beer to visiting dignitaries from other city-states or foreign lands would have been part of the protocol of hospitality and negotiation. Sharing a drink could help to build alliances, smooth over disagreements, or celebrate treaties. Let us seal this trade agreement for 500 sheep and 200 bolts of wool with a ceremonial jar of my finest royal dark brew. It's the ancient equivalent of a business lunch, but with more reed straws and fewer PowerPoint presentations. The administration of these royal breweries would have been a serious undertaking. Like the temple breweries, palace breweries would have had access to dedicated land for barley cultivation, skilled brewers, and resources for large-scale production. The beer produced would supply the royal household, palace staff, guards, and be used for state functions. The meticulous record-keeping seen in temple ration lists was likely mirrored in palace administration, tracking the flow of grain and beer. It's all very organized, even if the filing system involved damp clay and a sharp stick. As Sumerian society became more complex, the need for laws and regulations grew. While we don't have a specific Sumerian Beer Act of 3000 BCE, later Mesopotamian law codes, most notably the Code of Hammurabi from Babylon, circa 1754 BCE, which built upon earlier Sumerian legal traditions, do contain provisions related to beer and taverns. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Code of Hammurabi included laws regulating the prices that tavern keepers, sabatu, could charge for beer and aimed to prevent them from cheating customers or harboring criminals. For instance, Law 108 states that if an alewife does not accept grain as the price of beer, but accepts silver by a large weight, or makes the measure of beer less than the measure of grain, she shall be prosecuted and thrown into the water. Harsh, but it shows that fair trade in beer was a serious concern. You mess with someone's pint, you face the consequences. Another law, Law 109, stipulated that if outlaws gathered in an alewife's house and she did not arrest them and bring them to the palace, she would be put to death. Clearly, taverns were seen as potential trouble spots that needed careful oversight. These laws indicate that beer was a recognized commodity with an economic value that needed to be protected from fraud. They also reflect a concern for public order and the role that taverns played in society. The state was asserting its authority to regulate this important aspect of daily life and commerce. You couldn't just set up a dodgy beer stand and rip people off with diluted brews or inflated prices without risking a rather unpleasant swim in the Euphrates. The legacy of Sumerian brewing is immense, even if it's not always directly traceable. The fundamental techniques, malting grain, mashing to extract sugars, fermenting with yeast, established in Sumer thousands of years ago, formed the bedrock of brewing traditions that would spread across the ancient Near East and eventually influence brewing in Egypt, Greece, Rome, and beyond. While specific recipes and ingredients would change, the Egyptians, for instance, also brewed extensively but had their own distinct methods and styles, often using dates for flavoring. The core concept of a grain-based fermented beverage took firm root. The Sumerian association of beer with goddesses, Ninkasi, and with women as the primary brewers in domestic settings is also a pattern seen in many other early cultures. Brewing was often considered part of the woman's domain, connected to baking and food preparation. This began to change over time, especially as brewing became more commercialized and industrialized, but the ancient roots are there. The quirky tidbit for this final section concerns the very end of a beer jar. Sumerian texts sometimes refer to the dregs or sediment at the bottom of a beer jar, which was likely quite substantial given the unfiltered nature of cash. This sediment, still rich in yeast and nutrients, might not have been entirely discarded. It could have been used as a starter for the next batch of beer, a primitive form of yeast pitching, or perhaps even incorporated into certain foods, like adding a beery tang to bread or stews. Waste not, want not, even down to the last yeasty bits. Imagine scraping out the bottom of the communal beer pot to get a little extra flavor for tomorrow's porridge. It's all part of the ancient circular economy. The cultural importance that Sumerians placed on beer as sustenance, social bond, religious offering, and economic unit set a precedent. Many subsequent civilizations also held beer in high esteem. The Egyptians, for example, considered beer henket, a staple of their diet and a divine gift, with their own brewing goddess, Tenenet. The tradition of paying workers in beer also continued in Egypt. It seems the idea of a beer-for-work program had legs, or at least quenched thirsts effectively across cultures. While the specific Sumerian city-states eventually declined and were absorbed into larger empires like Akkad and Babylon, their cultural innovations, including their brewing traditions, didn't just vanish. They were adopted, adapted, and carried forward by their successors. The Akkadians and Babylonians who came to dominate Mesopotamia continued to brew and drink beer, and their texts also contain references to brewing and Ninkasi, or her equivalents. The knowledge was passed on. The open scholarly debate for this final part of our journey could be: how direct was the influence of Sumerian brewing techniques on later European brewing tradition, versus independent development or influence via other cultures like the Egyptians or Greeks? While there's a clear lineage in the Near East, tracing the precise threads of influence as brewing spread westward and northwards is complex. Did Roman soldiers pick up brewing tips from their encounters in the East? Did Celtic and Germanic tribes develop their own brewing methods independently? Or was there a slow diffusion of knowledge along ancient trade routes? It's like a historical game of telephone, with the recipe for beer being whispered from one culture to another, changing slightly with each retelling. The very act of writing down the hymn to Ninkasi, preserving the brewing process in cuneiform, was a monumental step. It meant that the knowledge was no longer solely reliant on oral tradition. It could be copied, studied, though studying a hymn is different from studying a technical manual, and potentially preserved for posterity, as indeed it has been. Those clay tablets baked hard in the Mesopotamian sun or in ancient fires have carried Ninkasi's recipe across nearly 4,000 years. It's a remarkable testament to the enduring power of a good drink and a good story. So, as the first light of dawn begins to gently touch the Mesopotamian plains in your mind's eye, signaling the end of our long night's journey, remember the legacy of Sumerian beer. It wasn't just about kings enjoying a fancier brew or laws trying to keep tavern keepers honest. It was about a foundational human discovery, a craft honed over centuries, a beverage that nourished bodies, fostered communities, and connected people to their gods. The specific taste of cash, its cloudy appearance, the feel of a reed straw, these are lost to direct experience. But the spirit of innovation, the joy of shared consumption, and the reverence for the transformative power of fermentation, these are threads that connect us back to those ancient brewers by the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. Their world has long since crumbled to dust, but their gift of beer, in its countless modern forms, is still very much with us. It's a long, long way from a clay pot of Vapor and Mooney to a modern microbrewery, but the fundamental magic is the same. The Sumerian legacy is not just in the grand ziggurats or the epic poems, but also in the humble beer jar, a symbol of their ingenuity and their zest for life. They figured out how to turn surplus grain into something that made life a little bit better, a little bit more enjoyable, a little bit more divine. And that, surely, is a legacy worth raising a glass or a metaphorical reed straw to. The gentle lapping of the Euphrates against its reed-lined banks seems to grow fainter now, as the images of ancient Sumer begin to recede. The bustling sounds of the city, the rhythmic chant from the temple, the clinking of clay cups in a tavern, all soften into a distant murmur. You've walked the dusty paths alongside Sumerians from all walks of life, felt the sun on your face as you surveyed the barley fields, and perhaps even imagined the cool, slightly sour taste of cash as it passed your lips through a long, elegant straw. The royal brewers have cleaned their vats for the night, the temple offerings have been made, and even the last patron in the Sabbatu's establishment has stumbled home under the starry Mesopotamian sky. Ninkasi, the lady who fills the mouth, has watched over it all, her benevolent gaze ensuring that the sacred art of brewing continues, a gift passed from one generation to the next, a thread of liquid gold woven through the fabric of civilization itself. The story of Sumerian beer is a testament to human ingenuity, to our ability to find wonder and sustenance in the world around us, and to our enduring need for connection with each other, and with something larger than ourselves. From accidental fermentation in a forgotten pot of porridge to carefully crafted royal brews and divine offerings, this journey has been long and hopefully, wonderfully soporific. The land of Sumer fades now, but the echoes of its life, its laughter, its prayers, and its brewing songs linger gently. May your own dreams be as peaceful and nourishing as a well-brewed draft of Ninkasi's finest, shared in good company. The fires in the hearths of and Uruk have long since turned to cold ash, and the once mighty rivers now trace different paths across the ancient land. The voices that sang Ninkasi's hymn are silent, and the clay tablets that held their stories and their beer recipes now rest in quiet museum halls, far from the sun-baked plains where they were first inscribed. Yet the essence of their discovery, that simple, profound magic of fermentation, continues to flow through human history, a quiet, persistent stream. As you lie there, letting the last vestiges of this ancient world dissolve into the softness of your approaching sleep, feel a sense of completion, of a journey taken to its gentle end. The kings and queens have had their fill, the laborers have earned their rest and their rations, and the gods themselves have been appeased with offerings of the finest cash. There is a comforting rhythm to this ancient life, a cycle of sowing and reaping, of brewing and sharing, that speaks to something fundamental within us. Allow your breath to deepen, to become as slow and steady as the ancient flow of the Euphrates in the dry season. Let go of any remaining tension, just as the Sumerian brewer might have relaxed after a successful batch was safely decanted into its serving jars. The stories have been told, the curiosities explored, the gentle humor savored. Now there is only the quiet, the stillness, and the soft embrace of the approaching dawn, or the deepening night, depending on where you are in your own cycle of wakefulness and rest. The subtle, earthy aroma of barley, the faint, sweet scent of malt, the tangy promise of fermentation, let these sensory memories become a soft blanket, warm and comforting. There are no more facts to learn tonight, no more ancient debates to ponder, only the gentle satisfaction of having spent a little time in a world so distant, yet so recognizably human. The need to gather, to share, to find a little joy and solace in a cup, these are timeless. May your own rest be deep and untroubled, as peaceful as a Sumerian field lying fallow under a canopy of brilliant stars, awaiting the next season's bounty. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.